This Convocation service indeed is a milestone occasion for the class of 2019 who do stand at the threshold of the next step in their call. But it's also a milestone for two long-serving faculty members who are themselves taking a step of faith into that unknown with the absolute confidence God is with them. Professors James Beverley and Donald Goertz are concluding their time at Tyndale, and we mark that in a special way on this occasion. And it's on this occasion that we ask them at this sector in their journey of faith to bring the Convocation address of 2019, their final charge to the graduating class. I do draw to your attention their biographies in the bulletin on pages 13 and 14, where you will find a glimpse of their extraordinary accomplishments and contributions to the mission of God at Tyndale through their teaching, their scholarship, and their distinguished and loyal service to students, to the school, to church and society. We've asked them to speak today, not only to honor them, which we do, or to give them one final shot at a mini lecture, but because we want to present to you people like them who embody, who are exemplars of the qualities of mind and heart and character and faith that we long to see in all of you as graduates. And indeed, qualities of life and faith to which all of us here can aspire. Dr. Jim Beverley, the professor of Christian thought and ethics, began teaching at Tyndale in 1988. I was thinking that's before some of you may even have been born. Jim says that in high school, he wanted to be a theologian. Isn't that an incredible story? Jim is a prolific scholar, the author and writer of books and articles too numerous to mention. And he's an engaging teacher who's renowned for shaking things up in the classroom with role plays and interviews and debates, a host of guest speakers, and an endless supply of believe it or not stories of the extraordinary people he has met and interviewed throughout his life. I spoke with someone who was here when Jim was hired. This is what they said. He was a great addition to the faculty, but he is not your typical theologian. I'm not sure what that means, but I do know that it's besides teaching systematic theology, his interests are expansive. Signature courses include things like world religions, new religious movements, ethics, evil and suffering, and his lifelong passion, Christian apologetics. Jim has an insatiable curiosity for a multitude of subjects, but in particular for religious beliefs and expressions in all their forms, and its positive and negative impacts on human flourishing. But Jim's driving intellectual curiosity is not only for ideas. He has a deep and profound respect and genuine interest in human beings, and especially in the lives of his students as unique individuals created by God, each with their own story. So of all the countless lessons Jim has taught through the years, here are just some of the enduring life lessons he has embodied and that we wish for our grads. This voracious but respectful curiosity about the world God has created and about the human beings and all their dignity and worth, each with a unique story. Beautiful authenticity and genuineness. There is no guile in him, as one of his colleagues said. And also a fun-loving spirit. There is joy in serving Jesus. Jim embodies that. Hold on to that. Following Jim's address, we'll hear from Professor Donald Goertz, who has been the seminary's church historian since 1985. He's the founding director of the MDiv in Ministry Church in the City program, a program that's the first of its kind in Canada. And he was also the director of another signature program at the seminary, the MTS Modular, a program geared for people in the marketplace who want to live out their faith before God. Donald's scholarly interests and his deep passion, indeed, is for the church in Canada, and for the way Canadian evangelicalism has taken root here, and for the ongoing history of Christian faith in its current, vibrantly diverse and multicultural expressions in a post-Christendom world. I talked to another person who was here at Tyndale when Don was hired. He was a wonderful addition to the faculty, but he is not your typical church historian. Hearing a pattern here? Indeed, he taught history 1 and 2, but he engaged in subterfuge, I call it. He infused history into every single course he ever taught. The history of the church in mission throughout the ages. I often think of Donald as a gentle but persistent provocateur, one with a prophetic gift, an asker of unsettling questions like this. How can we re-envision theological education on a missional paradigm? How can we call ourselves a seminary if we don't have a course on prayer or a course on poverty? How can we prepare people academically without forming them spiritually? How can we equip people for the Canadian and global context if we don't teach them about the mission of the church in the city? Throughout his life, Donald has been an innovator, some may even say an instigator, but one with a holy imagination. One of his favorite sayings is, well, I think every few years we should just blow things up and start again. And this is from a historian. But that's the beautiful paradox to me. A historian and an innovator, a lover of tradition who is in no way a traditionalist. So what qualities might you aspire to that we see in the journey and life of John Goertz? We pray that you will take care to nurture your intellect, but also your holy imagination and creativity. To be an asker of questions, a holy provocateur, and to be grounded always in a missional understanding of the local and global church. So today we're going to hear from 2 beloved faculty, in some ways 2 utterly different people, a New Brunswick Maritimer and a Mishkid Prairie boy, who found themselves in a common mission, a common vocation here at Tyndale. Neither of them is your typical theologian or historian. And what does that even mean? I think it means that they are wholly and utterly themselves. The person God created them to be, wholly devoted to God, each bringing what they had to offer to Jesus, praying that he would multiply it beyond their imagining to feed many. May it be so with you. I'll ask Professor Beverley to come, and then directly followed by Professor Goertz.
Members of the board, Chancellor Wilkinson, President Nelson, Dean Clark, fellow Tyndale faculty, and the wonderful staff that support the faculty and administration, honored guests and graduates of 2019. It's an honor to be asked, along with Professor Goertz, to speak to the graduates today. I waited 31 years for it, so... Now, when Dean Clark asked us to speak, it was several months ago, so I can honestly say this, it's been on my mind ever since. it's a burden. But God gave me 2 signs to help me. The first one had to do with the repeated comments by my bosses and my wife that this has to be brief. But shortly after I got the invitation, I was in my office and share an office with Victor Shepard, and I went over and picked up one of his books on Puritanism, and lo and behold, I read about the famous Puritan, great Christian leader, Cotton Mather. And you know what it said? When he prayed publicly, he prayed for 90 minutes, and even longer for speaking. So I took that as a divine sign. The second sign, how's the president thinking now?
Oh, he's fine.
Oh yeah, the chairman of the board told me that I could speak longer. Here's the second sign. Just after I was invited, I read an article. Now, to understand this point, you got to know a little logic. It's the argument from the lesser to the greater. Jesus uses it. If you, being sinful, know how to give good gifts to those you love, how much more God will give? Okay, that's the argument from the lesser to the greater. I read that an American politician giving a lecture, a graduate address at a secular university, and I regard this as significant, that this person was paid $100,000. So
You're done now.
I guess they don't read the same news report. There was also a private plane included. So I'm moving east, Donald's moving west, private jet. Okay, maybe not. Professor Goertz will be sharing in a few moments about how things are changing for today's graduates. I want to share about 2 things that shouldn't change in you and with you. First, you should celebrate your learning. Okay, just be honest here. Has there been some agony in getting to this point, gang? Put up your hands if there's been a bit of pain. Okay. You should celebrate that. If I can brag about our faculty and Tyndale, you've had the opportunity to study with outstanding faculty. I'll tell you how it is, for example. I thought, I learned French and Greek and German in graduate school, but I never learned Hebrew. And when I thought over the years I should learn Hebrew, I said, why bother? I can just go down the hall and talk to the Old Testament scholars. I'll never know Hebrew like John Kessler or Rebecca Idestrom. So celebrate that you've been at a decent school. There are worse schools. Celebrate your learning. The other thing, you've been educated on crucial topics where ignorance is rampant. You should celebrate that you know stuff that will help people. You should celebrate that you know how to spell hermeneutics or epistemology. You know actual facts about the Bible instead of common misunderstandings from people who have, as Spurgeon said, have enough dust on their Bible to write hell on the cover. You just think of all the things you've learned. Now, I'm going to name some things, but if I leave something out, you tell me. You've learned Old Testament, New Testament, church history, about Canadian society. You've done stuff on human nature. You've been into counseling. You know a lot about ministry tools, gospel, church, and culture, missions, world religions, new religions, evangelism. What else do we know? Anybody got other topics? Is that it? You're shy of your learning, aren't you? Celebrate your learning. But let me give you 2 cautions. Don't overdo it. Here's 2 ways you can hurt your learning. First, you can brag about it. Now listen, I don't know, if some of you are like me, you like to send some signals once in a while that you know quite a bit. I just learned Greek enough to impress people. If people start talking about the Bible and you go, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, they're impressed. So don't overdo it, because Paul said, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The other thing, try to be smart and wise, but don't be a nerd. Now, I've been a nerd. The only thing I can say is I used to be worse. When my wife, Gloria, who's sitting over here, when we first started dating, I thought she would be impressed by my theological learning. I used to have debates with somebody in her church, and I thought she'd date me because I knew the fine points of Calvinism. How many people in grade 10 know the difference between infralapsarian and supralapsarian? One night, New Year's Eve actually, we wanted to order some pizza or Chinese food, and my wife and I were with a group of people, and I phoned the order in, and the person said, well, I don't know you. How can I trust you? No kidding, because I don't get out much. I started talking about my religious background, professor at Atlantic Baptist College or whatever. And the guy said, so here I'm bragging about, that's a good reason to trust me with the credit card. The guy said, do you know John? And I said, yes, he wrote the fourth gospel. He died about... He interrupted me and said, no, I mean the owner, John. I know you're amazed my wife fell in love with me, aren't you? So listen, gang, it's been a lot of work to get here. You've had to pay money. You've had to sacrifice time. You've had to think of reasons why you're late, right? On papers. I thought of a new one. Now, this is an inside joke to staff, faculty, and students. Do you know why Tyndale students, staff, and faculty are the smartest in the world? It's because we've learned through the administration that your brain needs exercise. So every time we get in an elevator at Tyndale, we have to look at that little chart. B is 100. Level 2 is 300. Right? It's crazy. Like, does it have to be? So celebrate your learning. Second, celebrate the gospel of Jesus. Your learning is important, but its chief importance is that it's about the person and work and mission and miracles and teaching and death and resurrection and return of Jesus. That's the biggest thing. So cherish this message. There is nothing like it. Now you can know how precious the gospel is because someone you love shared it with you. You know Alvin Plantinga, one of the smartest people who's ever lived, a famous Christian philosopher who single-handedly changed American philosophy because he was so sophisticated in his defense of God. He said one time, good reason to believe in God is because your parents told you to believe in God. Because epistemically, you wouldn't even know what colors are or what the number 2 means if it wasn't for people who love you telling you. So there's a reason to love the gospel. Some people who loved you told you about it. But you can know how precious the gospel is because you're aware of your own frailty and sin. Now, I've got an exercise for you, which I don't believe anybody will do. When you get your graduation and your diploma and you got it all ready for the wall, put a piece of paper on the back that lists everything you've ever done wrong. Everything. Fill that page, and when people compliment you on your learning, you can say, well, there's the other side of the story. No, you're not going to do that, are you? But as we know our weaknesses and frailty, as we think of our sin, our laziness, our rebellion, that's why we love Jesus. You know how great the gospel is because it's a message of love and hope, and it's the answer for moments of tears and tragedy. And if we spent time today with everyone in the room and talked about the sadnesses we've seen and the tragedies we've witnessed, we would realize why there's no message like the gospel, which promises all things new. You know, I've had to think about that side of life when I've had some surgeries. I've had spinal surgery, knee surgery, hip surgery, and then 2 open heart surgeries. The last time, the surgeon said, I had a clot on the aortic valve, and the surgeon said, I'd give it 50-50. Those aren't good odds, folks. Now, thankfully, it got better. By the time I went into surgery, it was 1 out of 10 will die. And I didn't die. But boy, you know, you really think when you say goodbye. When you say goodbye to your wife and kids before you go in for surgery, you're longing to wake up on this side. I wanted to see my grandchildren more. But you know, when you face life's tough side, it makes you appreciate the gospel. You also know, and Dean Clark and Gloria, I'm ending soon. You know the greatness of the gospel, not just because it's an answer to the tough side of life, but because you know who to thank for the good things in life. You know who to thank for everything that God gave us that's wonderful. You know, the trouble with us is we're so used to the most miraculous realities, even in our own bodies. I found out recently that I have double vision. And by the way, you'd think somebody with double vision and bad knees would know enough to get help when you walk up the steps. I learned that on the way up. But you know, finding out about double vision made me go read about eyes. Have you ever thought about your eyes and how amazing it is? Did you know your eyes have 2 million moving parts? Do you know your eyes process 36,000 pieces of information in a single hour? Did you know that there are 107 million cells in your eyes? Yes, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we know who to thank. In Jesus, all things were created. And then, just briefly, you can know the greatness of the gospel because it sets in contrast with the lesser choices and philosophies of our world. If you'd asked me when I was 10 and when I accepted Jesus what the truth was, I would have said Jesus. And if you said, well, what about Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, New Age, witchcraft, Satanism? I wouldn't have known a thing to say other than Jesus is the truth. Now, after 47 years of studying philosophies and religions, I know it in a different way than when I was 10 years old. There's no one like Jesus. You know, it's mentioned in the program that I interviewed the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, along with Billy Graham and the Pope, is the most famous religious person in the world. He's the highest level of Tibetan Buddhism, worshipped as a deity, sort of, even though Buddhists don't believe in God. Do you know what the Dalai Lama told the New York Times? They mentioned Jesus in comparison to him, and he said, I'm not worthy to be compared to Jesus. When I interviewed him, just before I went through security at his compound in India, a verse came to me, Philippians 2. Every knee will bow to Jesus. So I knew when I went to talk to the Dalai Lama, my knees will bow to Jesus, his knees will bow to Jesus. Therefore, I was confident talking with him. I even tried to share, I shared the gospel with him. He had said Jesus was incomparable and that he was fully enlightened. So I said to him, Your Holiness, if Jesus is fully enlightened, doesn't that mean he tells the truth? Because if he doesn't tell the truth, he wouldn't be that enlightened. And he got the point, and I said, well, he believed in God and taught that he was the Son of God. Now, I was hoping he'd say, good point, Jim. I'll accept Jesus. I was hoping that. Do you know what he said? Jesus was allowed to teach what wasn't true because they couldn't handle it. Oh, that broke my heart. I still hope he's still thinking about that question, though. Now, lastly, with the celebration of your learning and the celebration of the gospel, it's wonderful to know that you can make an impact, even when you never expect it. A few years ago, I got a Christmas card that's probably the most meaningful I ever I cry easily, as you can tell, so I'll try not to cry too much. I was in the Dallas-Fort Worth airport. Some of us went to the scholarly conferences in Dallas, and on my way home I was really tired, didn't want to talk to anybody. I was in the airport, and I noticed a Hare Krishna lady over to the left in her robes. Hare Krishna, Krishna. So I knew it was my duty to witness to her. I went over and said hi, and then I say, I've studied about Hare Krishna. I mentioned the leader, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. I asked her how she became Krishna. No kidding, she said, I was raised Southern Baptist in Texas. It's a long way from Southern Baptist Texas to Hinduism and the Hare Krishna movement. I told her, her name's Rebecca, I said, Rebecca, I know a lot about your group. I know more than you do. It is not a good place for a woman. I said, I don't care if you ever go back to Southern Baptist, but you should go back to Jesus. So I gave her my business card. A year and a bit later, she sent me a Christmas. I gave her my business card. A year and a half later, I got this. Dear James, I hope this card reaches you. I doubt that you remember me, but I met you last year at the Dallas airport. I was caught up in the Hare Krishna movement. I have since left and gotten myself back on track. I wanted to write you and thank you. I don't think I would be where I am at today if people like you hadn't made an effort. So what's wonderful, folks, is with our learning and with God's grace and with our love for Jesus, we can make a difference. Thank you.
Board of Governors, Chancellor Wilkinson, President Nelson, faculty, special guests, and graduates, this is your day. Over the past years, you've pushed yourselves, you've worked hard, you've struggled to balance all the pieces of life, of family, and budgets, not least of all. Yet here you are, at the end and at the beginning. At points like these, it's easy to get caught up with what lies ahead in the anticipation of new things, or maybe just a time to rest. But it's equally important to stop and celebrate, to mark this occasion, to remember the journey, the friends, the family support, times of growth, times of transformation, all the hard work that is entailed needs to be honored, and you need to have a Sabbath rest as is talked about in Deuteronomy. Those of you who study with me, remember that. I was in your place in 1978, about to move into working with a church plant, and then to help pay the bills, got a job teaching at a college. It all went well. We were written up numerous times, the model of how to plant a church. It was a world of continuous change, and still seemed to be the way life worked. As a result, churches, denominations, ministries of all sorts were coming up with 5- and 10-year plans. Programs which, if followed, it was said, would double your membership in the allotted time. Churches would grow if we just had the right model. They didn't, but that did not seem to dampen the enthusiasm for them or raise a lot of questions. I remember arriving in downtown Toronto a few years later. It was the early 1980s. I found myself in church leadership in the best educated, least church neighborhood in Canada. What a wonderful place to be. It was populated by a generation who left the church. For these people, Christianity was seen as a failed experiment. I remember that time well. And I remember getting together with a group of us, and all leaders in downtown ministry context, talking and coming to the realization that we had absolutely no idea what we were doing in this new reality. We had not been prepared for the world in which we found ourselves. Looking for signposts, we began to read Leslie Newbigin. One of my dreams is that we'll have a statue of Leslie Newbegin at the entrance to the Tyndale, but I don't think that's going to happen. It was then that the lights began to go on. Canada had become a mission field. If we were going to be a sign, instrument, and foretaste of the kingdom, we needed to learn how to live as missional communities in the midst of a world which still viewed itself as Christian Canada. The reality was that we had entered into a world of discontinuous change, and it was fast. We had to learn to think on our feet. We needed to rediscover a confidence in the gospel and its power to capture the imagination of those who walked away from it. Could the church in all of its shapes and locations learn to be a community which went out and engaged people in their spaces with all the risks and uncertainties that this entailed? But the power of programs was hard to shake. They still did work at some levels because many, primarily Christians, still retained a powerful memory of the past. And we wanted places where we could feel that we and our families would be safe. That was to be the church. Now, 35 years later, each of you still find yourself caught in the midst of this hard change. Our larger culture struggles with it as well. We see it all around us in politics and even in this particular town. We are currently gathered in the town of Richmond Hill. Richmond Hill is the largest town in Canada. A designation is clung to even as its population swelled to well over 200,000 people. Why? Because of a nostalgia for the past. A belief that a town is a safe, friendly place while cities are impersonal, dangerous, and unpredictable. Yet even here in Richmond Hill, realities have had to be faced. A few months ago, the mayor of Richmond Hill stood up and announced that this community was in reality a city. Not only that, he said that it was urban and had all the things that defined a community as urban. It's into this world, with its tensions, uncertainties, lack of direction, that we're called to inhabit. It's one we are often reluctant to fully engage. It's a world where we seldom even know the names of the people next door or down the hall. Yet Scripture says we are sent with a mission to be about the peace and welfare of the communities in which we live. As you walk out into this world, our prayer is that you do it with eyes wide open. It is a post-Christendom world. It is a multicultural, pluralistic, urban world. You will face temptations. Those temptations will come at you in the form of seemingly good things. For example, they may come from that conference you attended, where they talked about what seemed to be an amazing, very relevant program, one which looked and worked so well in another place, and it should work here. Or you might believe that a spectacular creative worship will solve your problems. And probably all of you will face temptation that comes with new expectations. These are the result of the degrees that you're going to receive in a few moments. They will express themselves in the temptation to meet others' expectations and become very busy for Jesus. Going to work, coming home, having a quick meal, and then off to the church building to participate in a program. And with your degree, they'll most likely expect you to lead it. And you'll have no time for anything else. In that world, we lose something very profound. So rather, let me encourage you to walk out degrees in hand and begin to be people of hospitality. Who are your neighbors? Most likely, if they practice faith at all, it's one which many of you will see as hostile to Christianity. They may hold and practice sexual ethics, which you are fundamentally opposed to. But listen to what Jesus says. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your soul, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. For thousands of years, that question has kept coming back to us. And when we walk the streets of our neighborhoods, we ask, who is my neighbor? Surely Jesus didn't mean the one who lives next door to me. But that's where we must start. If we are to be about the work of the kingdom, it always needs to begin next door. But with a great program run from our building or on a short-term mission trip, they have a place. But mission hospitality begins with the one who can watch you every day to see how your actions line up with your words. That's the hardest place. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. We love the ends of the earth. Samaria's okay, but Jerusalem is hard. Jerusalem's hard. They get to watch us. Interestingly, we're never promised in Scripture that this is going to be safe. When the prophet calls on God's people to be about the peace and welfare of the city in which they live, he is speaking about a city which has shown no respect for God. It had torn down the temple and carried the people of God off as exiles. It was precisely to this people who saw themselves as exiles, uncertain, fearful, that this call came. While we in this region may at times feel levels of threat, we are definitely not an exiled people here in Canada. Christians inhabit every corridor of power in this nation. Our call as we go out the doors of our homes and engage our neighbors still requires us to risk letting go of power, to enter relationships with our neighbors from a posture of vulnerability. You see, the heart of the ministry, the heart of mission is hospitality. It is eating and drinking with the other. Do you remember what happened when Jesus commissioned the 12, the 70, the 72? He told them, go out, don't take anything with you, and whatever house invites you in, enter it and eat. Enjoy their hospitality. What this means is that it calls us to enter the other people's place of safety. And as Jesus models it, they're often not the most respectable sort, are they? There, where they feel safe, and we might feel a bit of insecurity and uncertainty, we sit down and let them set the agenda. It's learning to listen. It's learning to listen attentively. So caffeine becomes rather important for us if we're to be living as faithful Christians. We need to keep ourselves alert to be able to hear what's being said. You see, God is at work in the life of every single person we encounter. God is at work in every room you walk into. So as we go, we enjoy food, we ask questions, we learn to hear the people's hearts. We come to understand their questions, their fears, their hopes, their dreams, and we listen. We listen to hear where God is at work, and then we enter into that place, that conversation. My encouragement to you as you reflect on the next step is to keep it simple. Go out from here. Live with open hearts and open homes. Let go of the weight of the world or the burden of your church. God can and God will carry that. Learn how to be a friend to the other. Live with the confidence that whatever space you enter, God is already there, working, moving, active. All that is asked of you is that you be attentive to what God is already doing and enter that. In the process, we live out our call to be people who are about the peace and welfare of the communities in which God places us. May God's peace be with you.